Okay, we're coming now to one of the highlights of our conference, and certainly the highlight of today. It's my pleasure to introduce our guest speaker, Bridget Anderson. Personally, I find Bridget's work among the most inspiring that you can find in immigration settlement work and studies these days. And in particular, I appreciate her critical approach towards migration and migration studies. And also, I appreciate that Bridget is often pushing the envelope in rethinking some of the categories that we often take for granted. Professor Anderson is the Deputy Director and Senior Research Fellow at the Center on Migration Policy and Society, or COMPAS, at the University of Oxford in the UK. She has a particular interest in immigration and low-wage labor markets, trafficking, immigration enforcement, citizenship, and the politics of immigration controls. And she learns from and works with many individuals and groups, including immigrants and workers' organizations and No Borders activists. Her most recent book, which is on display at the RCIS booth, is titled Us and Them, The Dangerous Politics of Immigration Control. It's published with Oxford University Press. And you can also get a discount through a flyer that's also available on the booth in the back. And hopefully it will come out soon as a paper version. And now please join me in welcoming Bridget Anderson.
Thank you very much, Harold. Thank you for inviting me. I've been attending some of the sessions and really finding the conversations really fascinating and very challenging. One thing that Harold didn't mention in his introduction, and why should he, is that I'm a science fiction addict, hence this quotation. I'd encourage everyone who doesn't read sci-fi to kind of get enthusiastic about it. And the other thing to explain is I feel like I should state from the outset that I do not usually read the Toronto Sun, but you're going to hear a lot of Toronto Sun in my presentation, partly because obviously I come from a context that's very much informed by the UK kind of current political environment. And so I wanted to kind of think through some of what I was going to say in relation to Canada, and I actually found the Toronto Sun quite helpful as a kind of parallel to the sorts of newspapers that we have in the UK. Capitalist liberal democratic states are undergoing profound changes. Welfare states are being cut back, inequalities are growing, unemployment and underemployment is on the increase. The problem of poverty in wealthy countries is a problem that we are increasingly led to believe that is exacerbated by immigration. Immigrants take jobs, thereby increasing unemployment and lowering wages. They rely on social assistance, thereby both reducing the pot and undermining the social solidarity that the pot requires. As the Toronto Sun puts it, quote, "They take jobs away from Canadians, drive wages down, inflate housing prices and fuel tax increases to pay for their suite of entitlements, housing, medical care, education, etc." And this isn't just the kind of sentence that you'd find in Canadian newspapers, you find it in British newspapers and all over Europe too. The impact of migration on labour markets, communities and housing is generally in the political and public debate regarded as negative. If only it wasn't for these pesky migrants, everything would be okay. Or would it? When we decide that we're going to examine any social group, we tend to imagine labour markets and communities as inherently stable systems that are only subject to change because of the group that we're taking as our focus of interest. But of course, labour markets and communities are always changing. Women enter the labour market, we've got computers, there are demographic changes to the age structure of our population, and so on. Change isn't of its nature good or bad. Change just is. To live is to change. But in immigration debates, change is typically viewed highly negatively. When our gaze turns to the past, integrated communities spring up. Conflicts between the landless and the propertied melt away as to the injustices endured by millions excluded in multiple ways by categories shaped by gender, race and religion. When our gaze turns to the present, the more troubling aspects of our social and political economies become distorted, and states who don't generally care about their unemployed, their low-waged or their homeless suddenly have them at the top of their agenda. And as for the imagined future, as Harold mentioned in his opening remarks yesterday, where is all of this going? It is actually a blur. Perhaps some kind of 1950s with fewer housewives and more gay people is where ultimately we're supposed to be going. So public debates about immigration encourage us to don rose-tinted spectacles that give a very particular colour to our vision of the world. So what I want to do is to urge us to take off those glasses and to begin by moving beyond a logic which sees migrants as essentially competitors with citizens for the privileges of membership. I'm going to begin by asking who is a migrant and who is the citizen, and invoke the concept of a community of value to capture that these are normative as well as formal categories. The community of value, I'm going to argue, is defined from outside by the non-citizen, but also from the inside by the failed citizen, by the criminal, by the benefit dependent, by the sex worker, and so on. I'll consider the politics generated by exclusion and failure and ask how can these be challenged to enable us to move towards developing a common agenda that acknowledges but does not pathologize migration, and that centralizes migration because of its relevance to everybody and not only because of peculiar suffering endured by migrants. So first of all, who is the migrant? I'd suggest that there are three types of migrant: the migrant in data, the migrant in law, and the migrant in public debate. I'm going to focus on the migrant in public debate, but it's important to remember that this does not straightforwardly map on to the migrant in data or the migrant in law. The migrant that is the subject of quantitative data that typically informs so-called evidence-based policy making is usually the foreign-born. That is, they can often in fact be a legal citizen. The migrant in law that is subject to immigration controls is not necessarily the same as the migrant that is foreign-born. So when I'm saying migrant, I'm thinking more particularly about the migrant that is the antithesis of the citizen, the non-citizen that lurks in quantitative data and can also capture some of the elements of the migrant in law. In this sense, the migrant as non-citizen, it is important to point out that is really the term the migrant is really associated with the global poor. Its associated terms, the asylum seeker, the immigrant and so on, is strongly associated with the global poor. That is the migrant that is the subject of concern. The non-citizen professor, the non-citizen financier, the non-citizen architect is not the migrant that is the subject of concern, but the person that cleans their house is. So citizenship, too, is not just about a formal legal status. Indeed, in recent years, the concept has been seriously stretched, and we have a whole multitude of citizenships, from global to intimate to sexual and so on. And there's a danger, I think, increasingly that citizenship can come to mean everything and therefore nothing all at the same time. And its relation to legal status is overlooked. So the benefit of talking about migration is that it keeps us in mind of the importance of formal status. And political scientists too have done a lot of work recently to remind us of the importance of citizenship as a core institution of the contemporary liberal state. But this does not mean that either migrants or political scientists are blind to the more subjective accounts of citizenship. So citizenship is both legal and formal and normative. While legal status matters, citizenship cannot be reduced to legal status alone. States do not simply present themselves as arbitrary collections of people hung together by a common legal status. They present themselves as communities of value, comprised of people who share certain ideals and patterns of behaviour. The community of value is not simply populated by citizens, but it is populated by good citizens, typically law-abiding, hard-working members of stable and respectable families. So immigration and citizenship are not just about legal status, but fundamentally about status in the sense of worth and honour. That is, membership in the community of value. And the debates about immigration, I would argue, are as much about the contours of the community of value as they are about trade-offs and economic impacts. We can examine the borders of the community of value by paying attention to how people move into it, by becoming citizens. In liberal democracies, citizenship is typically derived from birth or acquired through naturalization. And this is the process through which non-citizens can become citizens and thereby achieve the same rights and positions as natural-born citizens, so hence the terminology naturalization. While for those born into citizenship, citizenship is essentially a free good, for those who acquire it, citizenship is more akin to membership of a club. Unlike the natural born, those who naturalize must fulfill certain requirements to be granted membership. And naturalization processes are very interesting because they attempt to link formal, that is legal status, with the more normative and substantive nature of citizenship. And it's in these attempts we can begin to see the shape of the community of value. So requirements that are on people who want to naturalize are not just formal, but they are expected to become good citizens. Migrants who want to become UK, Australian, Spanish or French citizens must show, for example, that they are of good character. And not being of good character is the most common grounds for refusal. In the UK, it accounts for nearly a third of refusals. Good character has some components that seem quite straightforward. Not having a criminal record, not being bankrupt, and having paid taxes run alongside requirements not to be involved in terrorism, crimes against humanity, war crimes or genocide. To testify to their position of a good character, applicants typically have to have a citizen of standing, a professional, that is, a good citizen, prepared to attest to their worthiness. The rhetoric of acquiring citizenship also draws on national values. In the citizenship test booklet Discover Canada, we learn, and I quote, "Getting a job, taking care of one's family and working hard in keeping with one's abilities are important Canadian values. Work contributes to personal dignity and self-respect and to Canada's prosperity." In practice, we can see that these values, along with others like freedom of speech, respect for human rights and the rule of law and democracy, while presented as national and particular, tend to be held in common with the citizenship requirements of all liberal democracies and are generally those agreed on by all liberals, regardless of nationality. But they are interesting because these substantive requirements reveal how the moral spaces of citizenship extend beyond the migrant. In the US, for example, involvement in prostitution, polygamy, or being a habitual drunkard all exclude from naturalization. But if we take off our immigration spectacles, we see, of course, that there are plenty of US citizens, natural-born, who are habitual drunkards, who still remain formal citizens. Just as not working hard in Canada doesn't mean that your citizenship is stripped from you. Foregrounding the community of value as expressed in naturalization processes helps us see that not all natural-born citizens are good citizens. Bonnie Honig has explored how the foreigner or the non-citizen defines the nation from the outside. The community of value is defined from the outside by the non-citizen, but from the inside by the failed citizen. So I use the term failed citizens to mean those individuals and groups who are imagined as incapable of or failing to live up to national ideals.